Okay, everybody, welcome back. We're on to Unit 3, which I titled To Investigate or Not to Investigate, That is the Question. For those of you who are literary buffs, that's a play on Hamlet, Act 3, Scene 1, I believe. To be or not to be. That won't be on the quiz, but now you have your piece of trivia for the day. And let's just jump in and go over what we're going to talk about this week. So in this unit, we're going to talk about the what of an investigation, and I'll explain what that is. But without a what, you're done. There is no investigation. And it is the first and simplest step normally, and something that every corporate investigator at one point in their career forgets to do and gets embarrassed. And I will give you one of those embarrassing stories as we go through. And then we have probably a little bit of time, I think, when we go through the what. So I'll go over the two basic types of investigations and talk about the differences, because when we talk about investigations and when we look at different investigative matters later in the semester, you're going to want to be able to determine what type of investigative practice you're going to employ for that particular type of matter. It's always good to understand, where we're coming from with definitions. So there's just three real definitions I want to go over for this week. And one is the very basic one, an investigation. An investigation is the examination, study, searching, tracking, and gathering of factual information in an effort to understand an act of wrongdoing. The key word there is to understand. An audit is the examination, study, searching, tracking, and gathering of factual information in an effort to discover an act of wrongdoing. So an investigation starts once you know that there's been an act of wrongdoing, which is any action by a person or persons contrary to written policies, regulations, rules, or law. These are the definitions for our purposes. You will find other definitions of investigations and audits and acts of wrongdoing, but this is what we're using. So the difference really between an investigation and an audit is an audit seeks to discover if there's wrongdoing. If you are a fraud major, you know that you go in to do an audit and you look to make sure everything is in order. All of the money is accounted for in the proper way. And if it's not, then the purpose of the audit has been met in discovering any act of wrongdoing. And if you don't find one, it's also been met because you didn't discover any, and that's a good thing, right? Once you discover an act of wrongdoing, then you would normally start an investigation. That's to understand the act of wrongdoing. So these three terms you'll need to know. So hopefully you've printed out the slides as I've recommended in the past and take some notes, but you're going to need to know these three when you take your quiz. The most basic elements of any investigation really are those questions that our 5th grade English teacher had us talk about when we wrote an essay for the very first time, right? You remember that, with the pencil that was the size of a horse's leg that you rested on your shoulder, and you wrote out that very first essay on the paper with the lines that were 3 inches apart, and you could see chunks of wood in this stuff. And you wrote about the what, the when, the who, the where, the how, and the why. Now, let me jump to the why and just tell you why it says sometimes why. And this is kind of off topic a little bit, but it's something you need to know. Motive is not something you need to prove. I'll give you an example. I had a lady that I interviewed. She had a company credit card, and her boss gave her the boss's password. So essentially, the woman had a company credit card, and she went in each month and approved her own credit card. Normally, a boss has to go in and look and say, okay, yeah, Brian spent $1,000 on this trip, and $500 on entertainment, and $1,000 on whatever training, and all good, and they sign off on it electronically normally these days, but nonetheless they sign off on it, and that's the way you keep expenses clean. This particular boss gave their password up to their employee and said, go in and do your own. I don't have time to do it. And over the course of about 7 months, this lady racked up a little over $100,000 worth of purchases at clothing stores, high-end clothing stores. So it really wasn't a lot of stuff. And when I interviewed her, after some back and forth, she admitted that she indeed made those charges, and told me that she had a shopping disease of some kind, right? She was obsessed with shopping. It was a compulsion. She couldn't help it. And that's why she did it. She didn't need the stuff. She had other money that she could use. And, she broke down in tears, and I held her hand and feigned tears as well, and I understood that she had a disease and she couldn't help it. But quite frankly, I didn't care. That sounds cold, but I didn't care. I only needed to prove that she'd done it, and she admitted that to me. That was my job. So I didn't need the why. Now, the why may be important to put in a report to say this is the reason the person gave me, because in some cases, the reason they give is worse than the thing they did, right? I stole the money because I got a heroin problem. Gosh, that's an unfortunate thing, but now we've identified you have a heroin problem, right? So I didn't need the why. So when I say sometimes why, you don't always need the motive. If you know what the motive might be, normally if it's theft of money, it's, for personal gain of some fashion. You can then look into the person's history and get some more clues as to who else may be involved, but you don't need a why. Now, that was off topic. Let's get back to the what. The what is the act of wrongdoing, okay? We're going to concentrate on that what because the what is extremely important, not only to start your case and give you the basis, but from a legal perspective, it's one element that you just can't miss. So, another story for you, because I hope you learn from stories, right? I was a relatively young, 30-ish investigator, and it was my first big case that came in. Done, a few small ones here and there, but this one was big. Somebody reported that a very senior executive took his spouse along on a business trip, and that she stayed in his hotel room, and the company paid for that hotel room, and that was fraud. And this was back in the 1980s, early 80s. Well, no, it would have been the late 80s. But it was pre-internet the way we know it today. And I know that dates me and it's very old, but bear with me because you have to understand that investigations took a lot more time before the internet. So I had this report that this senior executive took his spouse and she stayed in the room and the company paid for the room and fraud was committed. And so I contacted the hotel, which happened to be outside of the U.S., and that took time and money. And I had the receipts mailed to me, and it showed there were 2 guests in the room. On a receipt, it will normally say how many guests are in the room. I had the company credit card receipts pulled, and it showed that the company paid for the room. Now, I made a connection. There were definitely 2 people in the room, according to the hotel, and the company definitely paid for the room. I pulled the travel agency record because most companies use a travel agency of some kind, be it online or even direct now. That some places have a travel agent sitting in one of their offices if they're a big company. And it showed that the exec actually booked the room for 2. So now I had the proof that there were 2 people in the room, the proof that the company credit card paid for it, and the proof that the executive knew this, that he did it purposely, right? I had them. This was easy. I needed to set up an interview with the subject, this senior executive. So I go to see my boss, and I laid out the investigation records that I had, right? The receipts and the trail, right? It was solid. There's no question about it. This guy did it, and he knew he was doing it, and we paid for it. So I asked for permission to interview this senior executive, and I was pretty happy with myself. I mean, I had put this thing together. I'd spent a fair amount of time, if nothing else, waiting at the mailbox, right, for things to come in. But I was the stuff, man. I had really put this case together, and I had this guy, and he was a senior guy, and you get that feeling like, wow, this is big stuff, and I did it, right? And I was pretty proud of myself. So you can imagine how I felt when my boss said, "So what?" My boss at the time was one of the nicest people you will ever meet in your life. I mean, he would not hurt anyone's feelings for any reason. But he looked at me and he said, "So what?" And I was absolutely crushed. He explained to me the company didn't prohibit guests on business trips. So as long as the costs weren't borne by the company, and a room for 2 cost the same as a room for 1 at that particular hotel. They just wanted to know how many people were in the room for safety purposes. And any other costs from this trip were split out and paid by the executive. There was nothing in his record, in his American Express record, that showed that he charged anything to the company other than that room, and he was allowed to have a guest in the room as long as the room didn't cost more. There was no what. So here's the moral of that long story. Before you investigate anything, you have to establish there's a law, a policy, a regulation that was violated. I had a who, a when, a where, a how. I didn't need a why, but it was pretty easy. He wanted to take his wife on the trip with him, so she could see. I believe it was Italy they went to. And so that was easy. I had all those things, but I had no what. I had not established an act of wrongdoing before anything else. And an investigation went all the way through its course, and I spent time and energy, and I wrote this thing up. It was my first big one, so I wanted everything pristine, right? And I had no what, and therefore I had no investigation. So how do you establish the what? Now, I had a complaint, but I really didn't have any active wrongdoing. You know, a complainant can come in and say anything they want. You know, Brian just murdered somebody in the parking lot. Until I have a chalk outline around a dead body in the parking lot and some idea that a crime was committed or that an act of wrongdoing was committed, I don't have a what. So how might this look? So let's take a case. Suppose a company employee is reported as removing personnel files from the facility, and there's a written policy that prohibits such removal. Okay? So a person's taking out files, and they're not supposed to do that. How does this look when we write this up? How do we establish the what in both our report and in our mindset so that we know we're going to move forward? So if we were writing this in a report or even establishing it just in our mind, right, we need to make sure that this is what we can say with a straight face and gives us the basis for investigation. It's alleged that John X. Smith, Company VP of Operations, is removing confidential personnel records from the company facility at 789 Any Street, Slippery Rock, Pennsylvania. Such removal is in direct conflict with provisions of Company Policy 123B, which states, no personnel records may be removed from the site without CEO permission unless by order of a court or approved arbitrator. What we have done there is we have taken our complaint and we've put it into terms that show that there is a policy in place that indeed would have been violated if this allegation is correct. So if we find that John X. Smith, Company VP of Operations, did remove personnel records, we know we have a violation of policy that was reported, and we have our what. Now we can go and investigate. So here's another example, and I'm giving two examples because I'll use those later. It's a method to my madness. It's not just madness, so bear with me. But suppose a stockroom manager reports to you, you're the security manager, that 5 cases of 9-volt batteries valued at $1,500 is missing from the company stockroom. And yes, a case of batteries is about $300. So that's pretty common occurrence, especially around Christmas time. Scotch tape and batteries disappear around Christmas time from companies, and laptop computers disappear in August. There's a reason for that too. It's normally because people realize that their kid needs a new laptop. The old one's not going to work for school. They've spent all their money on tuition and books, and now they panic and they borrow a computer from the company and never plan to bring it back. But here's our example. Stockroom manager reports that 5 cases of 9-volt batteries are missing. Value is $1,500, and it's missing from the stockroom. If we were to write this up, or if we were to at least rationalize and get our what, we would say William H. Jones, stockroom manager, reported that 5 cases of 9-volt batteries are missing from the stockroom. Missing materials have a replacement value of $1,500. Jones reported the matter as a possible theft. Now, that part is important that you put in what Jones believes to be the case. You still have to establish the what, but if he says, well, it could have just, maybe we didn't get them or maybe I misplaced them, you don't even start until those things are done. But we have that possible theft. Theft of company property is covered in the employee handbook. Page 42 is contrary to policy, and persons responsible for theft are subject to disciplinary action up to including termination. Theft is also a criminal offense. If you don't have a policy in your handbook, you still can fall back on what the law allows. Theft of any kind is against the law. And in this case, we have a reported theft of $1,500 of value. And so if it is also a criminal offense, put that in there for 2 reasons. First, it gives more what to your investigation, right? Another reason you're looking at this is not only is the policy violated, but there's also a violation of law. But it also then reminds you that later on, once you find out what actually happened, and if there are more things discovered missing, you may want to take this for criminal prosecution, and it puts it up front that you have not ruled that out as part of your investigation. So what did we do here? We established that an act of wrongdoing is either in progress or has taken place, right? In progress on the removal of records, the person's still removing them, and the batteries had already taken place, right? They're gone. So we've established an act of wrongdoing, and we've done so by establishing there was a policy or law, or both in one case, to support further investigation. That is our what. We must establish the act of wrongdoing actually took place, and then we must establish that it is indeed an act of wrongdoing because of some policy, regulation, rule, or law. Once we've done that, we have the what of our investigation, and then we can move forward. So you have your what, you have your basis for an investigation, and there's a process that I would recommend you use, and that's drilling down. And you want to drill down to a better what. You want to make sure that your what is valid. It's a way to validate it, right? So think about, have you taken steps to determine if it's credible? So the person who's removing those records could be an executive working with an arbitrator. And that is allowed, right? Court of law or working with an arbitrator. So if you can kind of find that out before you really get too deep in your investigation, that's a good thing to know. Same thing with the stockroom manager. Did they actually search the entire stockroom? When they come in and make the report, your what is solid. He reported it as a theft. But you might want to ask, hey, did you check to make sure that they were actually where they're supposed to be? Did somebody maybe move them to another part of the stockroom? Or, did somebody put down they took out 5 batteries when they actually took out 5 cases in an order, and there's a mistake there? You can ask those questions to kind of make sure that you're starting your investigation in a proper place. There are a couple of basic questions you can ask the complainant to make sure that your what is solid. You kind of want to know whether the wrongdoing appears as malfeasance, misfeasance, or nonfeasance. And those mean a nonfeasance act is the failure to act where action is required. So, if I took 5 cases of batteries out of the stockroom for use in company business, but I didn't sign them out, I went in after hours, nobody was there, the cabinet was open, I grabbed those 5 cases because we needed them up in operations for some unknown reason why you'd need that many batteries, but we needed them, I took them up there. That's an act of nonfeasance. I was supposed to act, I was supposed to do something, sign them out properly, and I neglected to do so. Okay? Misfeasance is the willful inappropriate action or intentional incorrect action or advice. Okay? So, in this case, it wouldn't be misfeasance when we're talking about the batteries, because the next one, malfeasance, says that action injures a party, and injury not meaning physical injury, meaning any type of injury, including loss. So, in this case, the battery issue is either nonfeasance, somebody didn't sign them out and took them, or it's malfeasance. If it's malfeasance, you want to really put a little bit more work behind this investigation because you actually have a thief as opposed to someone who just didn't follow policy and didn't mean to take them and the batteries never left. You can sometimes determine that from discussions with your complainant. Is it possible somebody took these and didn't sign them out? And that could be possible, or they could say, no, these are locked in a separate cabinet, only I have the key, because batteries disappear, right? So we put them in a separate cabinet. I only have the key. I wasn't here after hours. I left at night. I came in the morning and they were gone. The lock is broken. That is certainly not a nonfeasance issue, right? So know those terms because first off, they're a good term to use when you finish out your report, when your findings tell you whether or not the severity of the action by the perpetrator was such that they just did something that they shouldn't have done. They did something they shouldn't have done with willful intent, or they did something they shouldn't have done with willful intent, and there was a harm done. That makes a difference, I think, to the decision makers. Again, that's the motive. You don't have to have it, but it is something that if you discover it, what the circumstances are, it is proper to note it. And then the final one is really what's important enough to the organization, right? If you have an organization where you have things disappearing all the time, no one's going to make a major case out of batteries. Okay? If indeed that person who took those files out used them because they were working on them at home and they shouldn't have done that, somebody may say, yeah, okay, that you're right, they shouldn't have taken them out, I'll handle it. And a senior person will go and talk to that person and say, don't do that anymore. If it's not important enough to your organization to devote time and resources, some loss is usually acceptable to most organizations. You won't clean up the streets of your company totally, right? There are some things that we just don't spend time on. So you can drill down to a better what just by asking a few basic questions up front. Make sure that before you start the investigation, you have your what, but make sure it's credible. Understand whether or not it could just be a misunderstanding as opposed to a true theft or someone who really wanted to violate a policy or law. And understand whether or not your organization finds it upsetting enough or important enough to devote your time and money into investigating. That's drilling down, in a nutshell, it's just a good exercise. Once you've written out your what, as we did in the other slides, now look at it and say, okay, is this what really something I want to spend my time investigating? And it's good to run that by your superior saying, this is what I have. Do you want me to run with this, or do you want me to hold back and handle it a different way? So the what of an investigation. It's your initial notice of a potential wrongdoing. It's the basis for your investigation. It might be an act of nonfeasance, misfeasance, malfeasance. It might be intentional or non-intentional, in other words, right? If you don't have a solid what, if you can't show that an actual crime or violation of policy, law, or regulation was committed, don't investigate, okay? It makes the entire case worth doing. And there's a legal reason why that is the case, and we're going to talk about that right now. So those of you who have taken criminal law courses, criminology courses, CJ courses, you'll normally come across the term standard of proof. And the standards of proof are related to criminal civil matters. And these are terms you've probably all heard: beyond a reasonable doubt, or clear and convincing evidence, or a preponderance of the evidence. So beyond a reasonable doubt is used in criminal cases, and we've all heard that, right? The jury is told, unless you find that Brian committed this murder beyond a reasonable doubt, then you must find Brian not guilty. It is the reason that we see sometimes cases that we think are pretty clear and convincing, using that particular term, right, not go to fruition, and the person is found not guilty. I think a classic example that most people can probably relate to, although it's getting a little bit old, is the O.J. Simpson case. I don't think there was too many reasonable people that watched that trial from start to finish that did not expect and did not think that Mr. Simpson did indeed commit those murders. Now, I don't know whether he did, but I think if you watched it, you'd probably say, yeah, there's a good chance he did it. However, there was an issue of a glove that was found at the scene that did not fit his hand. And in the courtroom, they had him try on the glove, and it didn't fit his hand, or at least it appeared not to fit his hand. And in the words of Johnny Cochran, still used today, if it does not fit, you must acquit. And indeed, the jury, based on that piece of evidence, said, we're not 100% sure. There was a bloody glove found at the scene, or at his residence, where he allegedly re-entered his residence after the murders, but it didn't fit his hand. And they found that they could not find beyond a reasonable doubt that he was guilty. Now, clear and convincing evidence is used in civil cases. Good example of clear and convincing. You are the sole surviving family member of your aging great-great-grandmother, and she is on life support. There is no brain activity, and you go to a court to ask permission, because there's that distance between you two, to remove her from life support to see if she can indeed live on her own. You have to show by clear and convincing evidence that it is unlikely that she would recover from her current state. So you can't do that beyond a reasonable doubt. You can't be 100% sure. I mean, there are people, you read them in the tabloids, all the time, people who sit up in their own coffins, right, and wake up at their own funerals. So you can't say that stuff never happens. It's not beyond a reasonable doubt, but it's pretty clear and convincing that if she's 100+ years old, she's been in a coma for a year, there's no measurable brain activity, and she's being fed intravenously and hasn't been able to communicate in that year, there's clear and convincing evidence normally that she would not recover, and a court would normally find that you can make the determination as to her fate. Preponderance of the evidence is used in civil suits normally, and all you have to show is that it likely happened. So if I slip and fall at the swimming pool, and the owner of the swimming pool, it's a private club, and the owner of the pool left chlorine granules on the side of the pool and didn't sweep them up, and that's what I slipped on. I just have to show that, the granules were there, that I slipped and fell, and that I had an injury, right? It's not where I have to show that that person, who put them out there, why they put them out there, the volume. It's really just a matter of, do the facts give us a 50-50 chance, a 51-49 chance that this happened? Preponderance of the evidence. Now, those are all for criminal and civil matters, and if you do take a case that's going to go criminal, you're going to want to make sure that you can meet the standard of proof of beyond a reasonable doubt before you even take the case to the police, unless it's legally required that you do, right? Cases of child pornography and actual assaults, harms, physical harms, you really do need to take to the police. However, you want to make sure you establish those things if you are in a criminal or civil matter. But normally, as a corporate investigator, the end result of a serious matter is going to be the termination of the employee. That's normally where it ends, right? Up to and including termination. The person is going to get written up, or they're going to get put on suspension, or they're going to be fired. And let's not downplay that, being fired thing. I use an example in another class. If you're making good money and you get fired from your job, you have suffered a substantial loss. But in the employment law realm, there's used something called the 7 tests for just cause. And basically what those are 7 questions that an HR person and an investigator and anyone who's making a decision as to termination of a person, are the answers to those 7 questions yes? They were developed way back in 1960s. I get 66 and 64 from different sources. I'm going 66, no matter there. But they were developed for use in union environments. Union environments have very strict protections to make sure people can't get fired without just cause. But a lot of HR and employment law departments in companies that are at-will employees, right? Those employees who can be fired without reason, right? If I'm an at-will employee, I'm not protected by a union in an at-will state. I can just go to work one day and my boss said, it's not working out, your job's ended. Or just say, your job's ended. And I have no recourse. I don't have to say, why did you fire me? They can just say, you're fired. But most HR departments, employee law departments really subscribe to the 7 tests or some variation of the 7 tests to make sure that they're covered from a lawsuit. An investigator has responsibility for 3 of the 7. And we're going to look at the 7 right now, and you'll see why the what of an investigation is critically important. So here are the 7 tests for just cause. If you are going to terminate somebody from their employment, you ask yourself, was the rule or order the employee violated related to safe, orderly, and efficient business operations? First question. So let's think about that one. If I say that everyone who works in my departments in the manufacturing operation has to wear a blue t-shirt, and that t-shirt needs to be tucked in so that the shirt tails don't get caught in the equipment, I've asked for 2 things, a blue t-shirt and that it be tucked in. One of those things, tucked in, is about safe and orderly and efficient business operations, right? I don't want somebody's clothing getting caught in the machinery, having them be pulled in and be injured, right? That would definitely be an unsafe act. So, asking to have a shirt tucked in is fine. Asking to have it blue, I'm not so sure that unless we have some other reason, I guess maybe in this example, if I asked them to wear bright green or a bright orange for visibility for safety purposes, then I could make that case. But simply arbitrarily asking for something that's not related to safe, orderly, and efficient business operations, you can't say if I just fired them because they wore a blue t-shirt that was the case. If they didn't have it tucked in, the answer would be yes. I move on to the next question. Was the employee given advance notice of the performance issue or the work rule, along with the possible consequences? Well, if I have it in my employee handbook that everyone will wear a tucked-in t-shirt on the line or will tuck their shirt in on the line, the answer is yes. If I never told them, or even if I just verbally said, hey, tuck your shirt in, then the answer is no. Advance notice of performance issue and possible consequences. Hey, here's the written rule. It says right here, if you don't follow the safety rules, of which tucking your shirt in is one, then you can be terminated. If I've done that in an employee handbook, a safety manual, something that is posted on the wall or that the employee should or acknowledges that they indeed saw and agreed to, then the answer is yes, and I move on. Before disciplining him, did the employer investigate to determine if he actually violated a rule or performance standard? There's your what right there. I mean, that's the biggest one for a what. Was there an actual rule or performance standard violated? And did we investigate to see if the person actually did it? Well, you can investigate all day long, but if there wasn't a rule or performance standard that met the cause above, right, that's written, the person knew about it, that's a no. And you need a yes on each one of those. Was the investigation conducted in a fair and objective manner? Well, that's something we're working on over the course of this semester to understand how to do fair and objective investigations. Did the investigation find substantial evidence to support the misconduct allegation? Again, the misconduct allegation is your what. And if you don't have the what, then all the evidence in the world doesn't support anything because there's no misconduct. And then, has the employer applied its rules, performance standards, and penalties equally to all employees rather? And is the disciplinary action appropriate to the employee's action and his overall performance record? Those two are kind of funny because the first one says that the rules apply equally to everybody. Have you applied them equally? If one person got fired for that, did the other person get fired for that? If one person got fired but the other one got a write-up, why is that? That's not fair. However, the next one says consider the overall performance record. So if you are someone who has a poor performance record on other things and then doesn't tuck your shirt in and gets warned and doesn't do it again, and doesn't do it a third time, whatever the discipline process is for that company, I may be able to say, yes, I took into account poor performance in the past and other matters, or this person has a stellar performance record. They just keep forgetting to tuck their shirt in, and we're going to write them up rather than fire them because we think that we can change that behavior. So those last two are a little bit in conflict, and I invite you to read those. In fact, in the reading for this week, there is a revision to these more modern vision. As I said, it was written back in the mid '60s. Professor Zane Reeves, writes a article about kind of modernizing these a little bit, but there's very few changes. This is pretty solid stuff. But as you can see, especially in the middle grouping here in these 7, right in here, there are some questions about the what that you are responsible for. And let's highlight those and just understand what we're responsible for. So, was the employee given advance notice of the performance issue or work rule, along with possible consequences? Well, that's what we wrote in our what descriptions, right? It was a violation of this in the employee handbook, and this is what it says can happen to you if you violate it. And we have to do that as the investigator. Before disciplining him, did the employer investigate to determine if he actually violated a rule or performance standard? Well, again, you have to establish that rule or performance standard, the what. Was the investigation conducted in a fair and objective manner? Not if you don't have a solid basis for the investigation. And did the investigation find substantial evidence to support the misconduct allegation? Well, the misconduct allegation better be solid first before you find substantial evidence, because you can find substantial evidence, as I did with the executive who traveled with his spouse. I found great substantial evidence, but there was no misconduct allegation. Those 4 elements, 4 of the 7 that are going to put somebody's employment at jeopardy perhaps, belong to you as the investigator. You need to understand the 7 tests of just cause and what your responsibilities are amongst those 7. Hugely important. Understand those before you do an investigation. The what matters. So what's after the what? We have a little extra time this week. I told everybody my lectures usually go about 45 minutes. We're at 33, so we're going to finish up and just move ahead just a little bit and talk about 2 basic types of investigations and why those 2 basic types are different. So after the what, now we're going to start looking at the other questions. Now this is just a teaser on this because we're not going to go into great depth on these actual investigations, right? But the methods that we use for the 2 types may overlap a little bit, but generally they don't. And there's one critical element, and it's the when, actually, that really helps you determine what type of investigation you're going to do. So we started our conversation with 2 reports as examples. One was person moving those files out of the facility, those personnel files that shouldn't have been removed, and we have our what. The other one was 5 cases of batteries worth $1,500 missing from the storeroom. We have our what. We've established that there are policies or laws in place. But what's the real difference between these 2 investigations? There's one critical difference between these 2 that will definitely impact how you move forward on your investigation. And the big difference between the 2 is timing. It's the when. One of these is taking place currently. Files are being removed. Remember, we said this person is removing personnel files. The other one was the batteries were taken. That happened in the past. So one is an ongoing concern, something that's happening currently and continues to happen, right? The other is strictly things that happened in the past, and that's what you're going to investigate. That's your basis for the investigation. If it's currently happening, you would do a constructive investigation. A constructive investigation is done covertly. It's used to determine whether a wrongdoing is currently taking place. So if this person is taking personnel files, pretty hard for you to go back and determine that they did it in the past. I mean, it'd be hard because if they're taking them and putting them back, that's a hard case to make. Even though somebody says it's happening, it's because they saw it happen. You've got an eyewitness, and we'll talk about eyewitnesses later in the semester, and they are pretty unreliable, quite frankly. But this person made a complaint, but it's pretty hard to show that this happened unless you catch the person doing it again. And if they're continuing to do it, you would set up a covert investigation, perhaps cameras, perhaps waiting till they go in that room, doing an inventory before they get there, having them leave the room at night, going in and doing another inventory, showing that the files are missing, going back after they return the files and showing they came back. Pretty convincing evidence, right? But you have to do those quickly because you're trying to do those covertly, right? It's going to be surveillance, private interviews, records reviews. You're going to do this, and you're going to have to get it done quick because I will tell you that you can't keep secrets. They just don't work. You have to go in and get permission to do a covert investigation, to put up cameras. Normally you want to check with an employment lawyer to make sure the area you're putting cameras is something that's legal to do. And word will leak out. It'll take time, but even with the most trustworthy senior executives that you have to share it with, word leaks out. Constructive investigations have to be done relatively quickly, and you really have to concentrate your effort on them because you have to get them done quickly. Reconstructive investigations are done when something's already taken place. Now you're going to rebuild what happened, right? That can be overt. You can be relatively open in that, right? If you have a theft investigation, the stuff's already stolen. There's no reason for you to, put up a camera unless you think it's going to be an ongoing investigation, right? So, something's already happened. You're not going to be able to catch somebody doing it because it's already happened. So interviews, records are less protected. You can take more time. As they say, the horse is already out of the barn on a reconstructive investigation. On a constructive investigation, the horse just keeps coming in and out of the barn, and you're going to catch it at some point, right? So those are the two main types, and it's the when. When did the thing happen, and is it still occurring, as to whether you go with a constructive or reconstructive investigation. And the two are handled a lot differently. There's a lot of different things we're going to talk about between constructive and reconstructive investigations. So an investigation can move from constructive to reconstructive when you're discovering things as you go along. So, you put up a surveillance and you watch the person and you see that they take the records out, right, on camera. You got them. But then you also see them stop by the storeroom and steal the batteries, right? They went to the storeroom first, and then you saw them in the parking lot on your camera there, and not only are they carrying files, but they got a big box under their arm. Now you've got a constructive investigation that's going to send you back to do reconstruction on another matter. A lot of times when you're doing a constructive investigation, you find other things going on. It's just the nature of the beast. And so a constructive can normally go to reconstructive in that manner. Reconstructive to constructive also happens when the batteries disappeared and you're working on that matter, and the stockroom guy comes in and says, now I'm missing 10 cases of Scotch tape. Now you potentially have an ongoing theft issue going on in that storeroom, and now you're going to say, okay, I'm going to start handling this as constructive. I'm going to put up some cameras, or I'm going to do a covert surveillance in another way, or I'm going to start to do things as if this is an ongoing crime, right? So they move back and forth between the two. There's a danger in constructive investigations, and that is that you didn't establish your good what. We're going to get back to the what again. Something's happening. I think somebody's been going in my office at night. I'm not sure, but I think somebody's been going in my office at night. And you say, okay, I'm going to set up cameras. You have not established any basis other than that person's gut feel. Okay? And that is called a fishing expedition. You're looking to see if something's happening. You need to have your what first before you embark on an investigation. Don't go fishing. Don't follow your gut. Right? Follow your gut to McDonald's. If you're following your gut kind of person, go get someone that goes greasy cheeseburgers. Don't use it to make business decisions. These are business decisions. Auditors have gut feelings, and then they go and look a little deeper. They see something, they say, that just could be an error, but I better go a little farther. They can fish. That's what an auditor does. An investigator has their what established. Then they establish whether it's going to be a constructive or reconstructive investigation based on whether it's an ongoing issue or whether it's an issue that happened in the past and you have to reconstruct it. So that's the main thing. But on constructive investigations, investigators tend to hear somebody say, I think something's happening. And you say, well, if someone is going in that office, that's a violation of company policy because you're not supposed to enter other people's offices without permission, perhaps. You may have a policy that says that, especially if it's a locked office, right? Policies sometimes say that, but you haven't established that anybody's actually done that other than somebody's gut feel. You haven't established your what. And constructive investigations tend to be the ones that people say, okay, well, I'll take a look at it. Next thing you know, you're setting up surveillance on something that maybe didn't happen and you're chasing ghosts. So just you use that as a warning that make sure you establish that what, then you establish what type of investigation model you're going to use. So in corporations, and this is really a general statement, but I just want to give you a flavor of some of the things that normally fall into constructive or reconstructive investigation models. A constructive model, if you have harassment, that's normally not a one-time deal. Harassment goes on and it goes on and it goes on until somebody has enough and reports it, right? And that normally doesn't stop it because you'll find it happening in the act. A constructive investigation will help you see that. Drug and alcohol use on the job. Somebody reports that someone is using drugs or alcohol on the job, you set up surveillance, right? Because it's not something that, I saw them last Tuesday drink on the job. Well, you're never going to prove that unless there is some real strange evidence out there other than the word of the person who reported it. I guess you could probably try to find 5 or 6 more witnesses, but that's something you want to catch in the act. Service vendor overcharges. That can go either way, but normally that's a fraud type of case where people are overcharging for services. They're doing something on time and materials basis. So they're going to build a new restroom in your facility, right? You need a new locker room built, and they say, okay, we're going to charge you $200 per man hour and for materials, and they charge you for 200 man hours, $40,000, and you find out that they only spent 100 hours there, and you can show that through forensics with the timekeeping system and other things, right? But you normally are going to catch that in the act. You're going to see it, then you're going to have to go back and prove it. Now, reconstructive cases are things like thefts, a one-time theft, a vandalism, right? Unless it's an ongoing vandalism, you're going to see something that was vandalized, you're going to go back and try to reconstruct how that happened. Threats, letters, bomb threats, phone threats are normally one-time events, and you go back and try to reconstruct those. They may go over into the constructive if you continually get the bomb threats. I've done a number of bomb threat cases in the past. They've always started as reconstructive, and then if you get the second threat, then you try to look at some constructive methods you might be able to do. Looking at phone records or having phones tapped if you think it's coming from a certain place. I set up a surveillance after the second bomb threat at a particular instance. The call was coming from a payphone. Believe it or not, payphones still exist when you get out in the middle of Kansas. And there was a payphone on the side of a gas station. And we got permission from another business across the street to set up a camera to point at the payphone after the second call from that phone. So we set up a constructive in that case because it was ongoing. But normally they're one-time events. Time theft is another one-time event. Somebody punching someone else's time card or writing them in as being at work when they're not. And then tampering, sabotage, normally always reconstructive. You've got to go back and find out why it happened, right? It's not an ongoing thing. So those are the types of cases that fall that way, but they can go back and forth, as you know. And I know it's a little bit confusing, but right from jump, you'll want to determine, once you've got your what, whether you're going to do a constructive or reconstructive investigation. So we're coming up on 45 minutes. Let's recap. Okay, you define the what, or you stop and reconsider whether or not to investigate at all. Define it by a written policy, rule, regulation, law. You have to have something that the employee was notified of, or a law that was broken in order to establish that what. Hugely important. And you have to do that before you do anything else. That act of wrongdoing has to be something that is an established act of wrongdoing, not just something that looked wrong, like a spouse traveling on a business trip. Looked wrong to me, but I didn't establish the act of wrongdoing. Drill down a little bit to validate your what. I just think that's a good practice. It's kind of a sit back and reflect on what you have, what you've written, and say, okay, what could have went wrong here? Why could this just be a non-event? Don't try to talk yourself out of it necessarily, but just try to validate it in your mind a little bit. Understand those 7 tests of just cause. In the criminal world, they have the standards of proof. There's 3 of them, and you pick which one applies to the type of criminal or civil matter that you're investigating, and that's what you have to prove. In our case, as corporate investigators, we look at the 7 tests or some variation of the 7 tests. Understand that what is your responsibility as an investigator. Remember, 3 or 4 of those 7 tests, the 4th one's a little bit wishy-washy, but 3 of those are clearly in your wheelhouse as an investigator to establish, and it really comes from the what. So it's hugely important. I know that I keep harping on that, and it's the easiest part of the investigation. It's a couple of paragraphs in the beginning. It's before the work started, but it's important to understand that you don't start the work until you have that. Know the difference between constructive and reconstructive investigations, and that is really based on the timing, right? Is it an ongoing event, or is it an event that happened in the past that you need to reconstruct? Don't go fishing if you have a constructive investigation decision, right? Go back and validate your what again. If you decide on constructive, in fact, I think it's a good practice to go back, reevaluate that what, and say, do I really have a case here, or am I just looking for a case? Am I using the investigative process to find my what, right? If that's the case, go back to square one, start again, because you don't go fishing. That's a recipe for disaster. So this week's deliverables, you have the lecture, which we've just done. Thank you very much for your attention. Then you're going to do the reading, and the reading really is the 7 tests written out, so you can see them, and then an alternative, a more modern alternative to the 7 tests, which your company may use, or your company may not even use them, but you should have them in the back of your mind, because if you use those, you're pretty much covered, and you're covering the bases. But I think Dr. Reeves' article is a pretty good one about how we need to modernize these things a little bit to fit more with the modern workplace. So take a look at that, and I'd just be interested in what you think about whether or not those should be modernized. There's a quiz this week. The quiz is 10 questions. Not everybody gets the same 10 questions. Not all the questions are in order. The answers are in order. So please, if you're going to work together, that's fine. I have no trouble with people working together. But please just don't work together with here's the answers A, B, C, D, whatever, because that's a recipe for disaster. Based on the algorithm that I set up, you have about a 1 in 250 chance of getting the right answer if you do it that way. Don't do it that way. Contact me if you need anything. Please let me know how the course is going for you. I can't make improvements as we go along, and I try to do that if indeed, I don't understand that you're having trouble. So please let me know how things are going. With that, I will look forward to hearing from you if you need anything, and don't forget to get the reading and the quiz done. Thanks for your attention. Have a great week.